knowledgeable of the song, or I can't.
That's correct. You have to, it's like my cousin says, if you're going to play music, you better know the melody.
Yeah.
What I do, I pick out 6, and I let her pick out the 3 that would be easier on her to play.
Good. It's working. If you have a Bible and you find it helpful, please turn in it to Isaiah chapter 40. This is where we'll be spending our time. When we read our Bibles, lots of times, I mean, we all do this. We read them contemporaneously for our own life. We say, well, how does this apply to me? And there's nothing wrong with that. I don't want to discourage that in any way. But there's a richness that's lost if the passage and the reason for which it's written into the time it's written isn't considered. That becomes lost. If we don't consider why the passage is written, to whom it's written, what's going on when it's written, all of those features, then some of the passage escapes us in terms of what it actually says. And this is one of those. The Jews are at a point in their history where nothing would give them an indication that God is superintending the universe. From their point of view, all is lost. Very critical feature of their particular history. Let's look at the text. I'll begin reading in verse 21 of chapter 40 of Isaiah. Do you not know? Do you not hear? Has it not been told to you since the very beginning? Have you not understood from the time the earth's foundations were made? He who sits on the throne, who sits on the earth's horizon, its inhabitants are like grasshoppers before him. He's the one who stretches out the sky like a thin curtain and spreads it like a pitched tent. He is the one who reduces rulers to nothing. He makes the earth's leaders insignificant. Indeed, they're barely planted, they're barely sown, they barely take root in the earth, and then God blows on them, causing them to dry up. And the wind carries them away like straw. To whom can you compare me? Whom do I resemble, says the Holy One. Look up at the sky. Who created the heavenly lights? He is the one who leads out their ranks. He calls them all by name because of his absolute power and his awesome strength. Not one of them is missing. Why do you say, Jacob? Why do you say, Israel? The Lord is not aware of what's happening to me. My God is not concerned with my vindication. Do you not know? Have you not heard? The Lord is an eternal God, the creator of the whole earth. He doesn't get tired. He doesn't get weary. There's no limit to his wisdom. He gives strength to those who are tired. He gives to the one who lacks power renewed energy. Even youths grow tired and weary. Even the strong will clumsily stumble. But those who wait for the Lord's help will find renewed strength. They rise up as if they had the wings of eagles. They run without growing weary. They walk without getting tired. And of course, that last passage is one that if you've been churched for any length of time at all, you're very familiar with. I have a placard at my house given to me when I first got here to this church. And it has that quotation for that exact passage on the placard. Well, this comes from a great period of history in Israel. The Assyrians are on their doorstep. And no nation in Mesopotamia has been able to resist the Assyrians. They have overrun every nation that they have encountered without any great difficulty. And of course, they seek to overrun Judah, the southern kingdom. Isaiah is in Hezekiah's court at this time in history. Isaiah is prophesying to Hezekiah regarding the Assyrians, and Hezekiah is listening to him. The Babylonians who came after the Assyrians, the Sumerians prior to the Assyrians, all of these Mesopotamian groups have gods that they worship, all of them. And they each one believe that their gods are helping them in their military expansions. All of them believe that. The Assyrians worship a god named Ashur. And if you, Ashurbanipal, the king, he's named after that deity. Very common that some of these kings would be named after a deity within their pantheon of gods. The Assyrian army was extremely brutal, extremely fierce. They were feared throughout Mesopotamia. They are the superpower at this time in history. This is the 700s BC. And there's a reason they're brutal. They're not brutal just because they're mean people. They're brutal because they can breed terror, and terror becomes a very useful tool. If you're going to overrun other countries, and if you're going to maintain your rulership over these other countries, then the best thing you can do at this time in history is cause these other countries to fear you. And that's exactly what they do. For them, it was not sufficient to merely conquer. They're very different from the Babylonians. The Babylonians were pretty brutal, but they weren't brutal like the Assyrians who preceded them. The Assyrians, if you go back and look at some of the archaeological reliefs pertinent to the Assyrians' life and pertinent to their military conquests, you see things like people being flayed alive. You see people with hooks through their noses being led, each one chained to the other. You see people being drawn and quartered. You see people's heads on pikes on a pole. You see pyramids of heads left inside the citadels that they conquered to say, okay, the Assyrians are here now, and this is what will happen to you if you resist. So their terror is effective. It's working for them. And they're overrunning everybody they encounter. If you want to read the history of the Assyrian encounter with Hezekiah, 2 Kings 18 and 2 Chronicles 28 and following, you'll read that account in there. It's a very interesting history. And in that, you'll read that the Assyrians openly challenged God. Openly. The Rabshakeh, which is a political title, sat on the wall, the Jerusalem wall, shouting down to the Jews, "Why do you trust your God? Why do you trust Hezekiah? Don't pay attention to Hezekiah." One of the Assyrian reliefs says of Hezekiah, this is very interesting. Here we've got archaeological evidence of Hezekiah, the king of Judah, where it says, and Hezekiah was like a caged bird from the Assyrian point of view, trapped in Judah, trapped in his palace, because the Assyrians were on the doorstep. And they challenged God by saying, don't trust God. We're the Assyrians. All of these other nations, they had gods too. We overran every one of them. Why do you think you're any different? It's a valid point. I mean, let's be fair from the Assyrian point of view. Why should they not challenge God? Every deity they've encountered throughout Mesopotamia, they've overrun. Don't we think that those people who were, say, worshiping another deity, whom the Assyrians encountered, were praying to that deity the Assyrians would lose? Sure they were. So the question for the Jewish mindset at this point in the history would be, where is God? Where is he? The Rabshakeh said we shouldn't trust him. Hezekiah trusts him. Isaiah is advising Hezekiah to trust him. But from a Jew's point of view, in that culture at that time in history, they're just like you and me, right? They want food and shelter and security from their enemies, both within and without. They want safety. They want laws that they can count upon. All of that. And we're living in the era of Rex Lex, which means simply the king is law. Everybody knows what a Tyrannosaurus Rex is. That word has a meaning. It means literally the lizard king, the terrible lizard king. That's what it means. And so Rex Lex means if a king decrees it, it becomes law. I would encourage you to familiarize yourself with the book of Esther, where you see the king of Persia decreeing laws that affect the Jews immensely. So if you've got a righteous king, if it's your king or the king who's conquering, if it's a righteous king, then you can count on it. The laws are going to be passed according to human welfare. If it's an unrighteous king, then you never know what you're going to get. I mean, you had Hezekiah, the righteous king, passing all the laws he passed, and all the decrees he made, bringing the worship of God back into Judah. He was followed by his son, who undid all of that. Kind of like what's going on for us right now, right? Somebody sits down at a desk and starts writing new decrees, and things change in our country. It's not any different in that way. We don't know what to expect, and they didn't know what to expect either. Well, the Assyrians were unpredictable for sure, because you just didn't know what they were going to do. And they didn't have the welfare of the conquered in mind at all. They had the Syrian welfare in mind. So, if they subjugated you, as they were trying to subjugate Judah, they didn't care whether you lived or died or what happened to you, as long as you were a subject. As long as you obeyed, as long as you paid the tribute, as long as they were seen to be in charge without any questions asked, and they had what would be called today a scorched earth policy, so that you would know who was in charge. You know, in the Civil War, we had a scorched earth event. Sherman had his march. And we look back on that, we think that's terrible. And it was. If we'd have been living at that time, we'd have thought that this is just the most incredibly terrible thing that has ever happened. But it's a very common practice in military. Because what it does is it takes away the conquered's ability to make war. Takes their will to make war away from them. So it was effective then. It's effective in the time also of the Assyrians. So, with all that picture that I've painted, this terrible picture of what was going on in Judah at that time, this is what's happening when this prophecy comes. Now think about that for a minute. The first thing that strikes me of this prophecy as I think about where the Jews were is this sounds like something you would say to a frightened child, to me. It really does. I'm not saying that's bad. I'm just saying if a child's really afraid. Becky and I watched this I would encourage you to watch this movie. It's a Netflix movie. It's called A Monster Comes. Now it sounds like it's going to be some kind of science fiction thing, but it's not. It's a story of a child whose mother is dying of cancer. And this whole picture of what's going on is one that is to take you through this child's mental machinations as he loses his mother. And in it, she's telling him, this treatment's going to work. It's going to be all right. And it's not going to be all right. And so when I read this passage, it sounds like that to me. It's like this is a comforting way to speak to people who are losing everything. How would an ancient Jew have heard this prophecy at that time in their history? Let me read you a psalm, similar psalm. Psalm 147, he heals the brokenhearted. He bandages their wounds. He counts the numbers of the stars and he names them all. That makes a lot of sense. It sounds just like the same thing that Isaiah has said here. In other words, you've got the God of the whole universe who is for you. That's what's being said. Now, my question is, why do these words not encourage today? Well, let's all stop for a minute as believers and be really, really internally honest with ourselves. Is it not, if we're really honest now, we come to a crisis in our lives and we have a fear that this prophecy will not turn out to be true for us in the way we think. Is that not true? Do we not look at something that's foreboding in front of us and we're believers? We know that God, He sees it too. But there's a part of us that holds back because we think, God might not come through for me here. Well, the way we answer that question is based on one thing, one word, a big word. It's not that big in terms of the numbers of letters, but it's huge in what it means, and that's the word expectations. Now, I did a little bit of work with a person who was trained in family systems in Pennsylvania. And I can tell you from experience straightforward that in a marriage, expectations will bring about some of the most incredibly strenuous, difficult times in that marriage that you can possibly imagine. Because people come into marriage with certain expectations. It doesn't take very long before some of those expectations become dashed to the ground by marriage, because you're dealing with another person who may not have your expectations. Well, take that and extrapolate into something more fundamental and say, what about our expectations of what we think God's goals for our life are? What's the goal for human life? Well, if you ask most people, they will say that we would be happy. That's the goal. And most Christians, I'm afraid, lots of them, somewhere in the back corners of their mind, think that God's goal is for you and me to be happy. That's the death knell for life with the Lord. It really is. Because the expectation breeds this response. No matter what the difficulty is, even if it's as minor as a paper cut, God's not doing his job. That's how it goes. I mean, I'm saying this because of myself. I'm not saying you. I'm saying me. I mean, you have those days where everything you do goes wrong. I hate those days. I have lots of them. Usually Monday is like that. For some reason, it's the weirdest thing. I mean, there's nothing special about Monday. If you take away the names of the days, they don't mean anything at all. And yet, Monday comes around and everything goes wrong in my mind. God's not doing his job. What's the matter with you? God, how come you're not taking care of all this stuff for me? It's really an argument, if you want to wax philosophical about it, it's a species of the argument from evil that says there's evil. And if God's good and all powerful, how come there's evil? He's not doing his job. So when I read a passage like this, rise up with the wings of eagles. Boy, that sounds really good, doesn't it? Lofty and powerful and just soaring above it all, that kind of picture. But did it feel like that to the Jews when the Assyrians were parked on the doorstep? After all the things they'd done to all the people groups they'd already conquered? I want us to think about it for a minute. I mean, I think we look back on the biblical characters and we make them out to be heroes that they're not. I really do. I think that the Bible, in the way it's written that these people are examples to us, right? I mean, to some degree. And so they become almost heroic, but we forget that that's a person, a real person, who had real desires for themselves, for their families. It makes these kinds of passages, and I'll just say it for what I think I see a lot of times in them, is that they become a kind of a taunt. You're going to rise up with the wings of eagles when somebody's in a hospital bed. I mean, it just doesn't fit. The two things don't fit. Imagine, let's make it a contemporary example. I want you to, in your mind, imagine this. You're standing outside the barbed wire charged to 10,000 volts, which is what all of the concentration camps in Nazi Germany, that's how they were. You had 2 layers of barbed wire. The inner layer was 10,000 volts. You hit it, you're dead. You're not going to climb through that wire. And if you happen to get through the wire, there's a machine gun tower up there. You're on the other side of it. You're looking across at a Jew in his striped or her striped jumpsuit, shaved head, tattoo on their wrist with their number, emaciated, and you read this passage to them. You're going to rise up with the wings of eagles. How does that fit? The difference is the perspective, isn't it? You know, when we're sitting here comfortable in a church or comfortable at home, or I go home and I'm eating my meal and I look across and see that placard with that verse on it, I feel really good while the food's falling down inside my stomach. It feels good to me. And I like it. But it's kind of like if you wrote a message on the water. You can trace it out and see it, but as soon as you lift your finger, it's gone. Something has to take place in you and me for this prophecy to live. And it's not something we can do. I want to read something to you here just to set the perspective. God says this from the same prophet a little later on. He says, "Indeed, my plans are not like your plans. My deeds aren't like your deeds. Just as the sky is higher than the earth, my deeds are superior to your deeds, and my plans are superior to your plans. The rain and the snow fall from the sky, and they don't return. Instead, they water the earth, they make it produce and yield crops, they provide seed for the planter and for those who must eat. In the same way, the promise that I make doesn't return to me, having accomplished nothing. No, it's realized as I desire it, and it's fulfilled as I intend." That changes the expectation a lot for me. It says that God's got expectations too. And He's got a plan. Am I fitting into that plan? Maybe, sometimes, maybe not other times. Is it that we've just got to look at a prophecy like this and pony up some kind of fortitude that says, I'm going to rise up with the wings of eagles? I don't think so at all. No, I think it's more that we would just look squarely at the circumstances of life and try to have God's perspective as we do it. Which is better? Let me ask you a question. Which is better, that God removes all the obstacles of life like some kind of genie? Can you imagine how full the churches would be if that was the way it is? You couldn't build a church big enough to hold all the people that come for that. Who's not going to come for that? Come have all your problems solved by the great genie. But that's not real life. No, what we have to do is, firstly, we've got to believe. The Bible says anyone who comes to God must first believe that God is and is a rewarder of those who seek him. And secondly, when it comes to this kind of thing, when we're facing those things in life, I'll just say it for Rip's perspective, we got to ask God to give it. If I'm going to have the right perspective about things like this in my own life, if I'm going to be able to live through this life with all that it brings properly, then God's got to do that. I can't do that. And there's only one way to get that, and that's to ask God for it. Because I'm convinced, I am totally convinced. If I weren't convinced of this, I could not remain a believer. That's how serious this is to me. That in the moment when the great crisis comes and God's grace is absolutely needed, when that's all we've got, he's going to show up. I believe that. I don't know where everybody is today, but if I said anything about which you've got a question, you want to pray with me, I'll stay here.